Hello, in just a moment, the press preview as we take a look at the morning papers. First, though, a reminder of our top stories here this evening. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, has set out how she plans to negotiate Brexit in a white paper. Labour called it a wish list, not an action plan. The Bank of England has raised its forecast for economic growth for a second time this year to 2% and has kept interest rates at a record low of 0.25%. And investigators are reviewing a series of torture cases against British soldiers in the Iraq War after the lawyer who brought them, Phil Shiner, was struck off for misconduct and dishonesty. Hello there, you're watching Sky News and the press preview. Over the next half hour, we'll be seeing what's making the headlines with the Times columnist Melanie Phillips and the editor of politics.co.uk, Ian Dunt. So hello to both of you. So let's take a look at what's on those front pages then. And The Guardian goes with Defence Secretary Sir Michael Fallon, warning Russia is weaponising misinformation in an attempt to destabilise Western countries. The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, is on the front of the Metro, having told MPs Britain's best days are still ahead of us. Changes to freedom of movement rules may be done in stages after the UK leaves the EU, writes The Eye. The Financial Times reports on the Bank of England upgrading UK growth forecast significantly for the second time in 6 months. The most damaging rail dispute in 2 decades is about to end, says the Times, after union bosses claim victory over driver-only trains. The Daily Telegraph leads with calls for human rights lawyer Phil Shiner to be struck off over his false allegations against British soldiers. The Daily Express says scientists have discovered people with back pain should forget taking painkillers and start stretching instead. The Daily Mail reports that supermarkets are rationing vegetables after extreme weather ravaged the Mediterranean farming belt. According to the Daily Mirror's own report, gorillas are being killed and eaten by miners collecting metal for mobile phones. The Sun has claims about Kylie Minogue's love life. And retired footballer Frank Lampard is off to Hollywood to be a movie star, so says the Daily Star. So lots to talk about there with Melanie Phillips and Ian Dunt. And you're going to kick off with Brexit. You've picked out the Eye's front page to start with. This comes out of the government's white paper on Brexit, revealed by David Davis today in the House of Commons. They've picked out what it has to say in there about immigration and EU migration.
Yeah, she already alluded to this, actually. She alluded to it in her speech, the big one, you know, Lancaster House one, where she sort of said, well, look, we've got the 2-year bit, there's going to be some kind of transition. She calls it implementation, which is an extremely misleading word for what she's talking about, because it's pretty evident she's going to still be negotiating at that stage. There'll be nothing to implement then. And she basically said already, oh, you know, we'll negotiate how that period works. Probably that is going to involve a bit of immigration. Now, this is the beginning of her testing to see how much she's going to be able to get away with the Daily Mail and the Daily Express and the right wing of the Tory party and UKIP. If they hold her to a line on that, that is exactly the thing that in sort of, you know, early 2019 or late 2018 could actually trigger a chaotic Brexit of us having to pull out. If people are willing to be more sort of, you know, relaxed on it, it goes on for another few years,
I don't think
there's no reason that should happen.
I don't think she would be testing that. I think she is absolutely sure I don't know, but I would surmise she is absolutely sure in her mind that if there's one red line the British people will not cross, it is the immigration one. There is no room, there is no wiggle room there.
This is for interim, so this is not for the final package.
But people are going to be, you know, quite tolerant and patient if they think it is really an interim, if they can see that it's all going to go in the right direction from their point of view, and then they will put up with an interim. I mean, you know, people are not completely unrealistic. Even Brexiteers, Ian, I would venture to suggest.
I'm yet to be convinced.
I know you are. But nevertheless, I mean, you know, everyone can see, you know, something like this, of this magnitude, it can't be all achieved overnight. So the crucial thing is if people think that the Prime Minister is A, acting in good faith, B, has actually pulled off the arrangement that will deliver, at the end of the day, what people want. The end of the day means that, you know, if they can see that it's going in the right direction, they will put up with a certain amount of delay. But if they think that they are they've actually been sold a pup, that actually she has kind of reneged, then they'll be held to pay. She knows that. She knows that. There's no wiggle room for her.
And I don't think anyone seriously thinks that about her. I mean, I think everyone's pretty convinced, you know, she has signed up, she's a convert, she's going to deliver on this thing. I don't think anyone on the hard Brexit front really thinks she's not going to do it. However, I don't think that the domestic political culture is in a place where it can accept the kind of compromises it's going to have to make for the period between 2019 and about 2025, where, I'm sorry, but it's going to have to keep on paying into the EU budget, much more trouble on budgets than is originally been anticipated. It's going to have to accept the European Court of Justice jurisdiction if it wants to keep the regulators, if it wants to keep the infrastructure that it has, and it's going to have to accept probably freedom of movement over that period, or we're going to have a very catastrophic... No, it's not.
This is your wish list.
This is simply an understanding of the dynamics as they're there. That is what the EU will demand. Because
How do you know? You're not in the negotiation. You have
because
no idea.
Because it cannot allow you. It's like saying, I'm going to go to France on holiday, but I refuse to abide by French rules. That is not how the world works.
How the world works is who actually has the cards in his or her hands.
And that's exactly why we're going to lose.
Well, this is where we differ. I think that Britain has a tremendously strong hand to play. The problem has been hitherto that despite always having had a strong hand, because it's so much in the EU's interest to keep us on board in the past, because of the threat we pose to it by being independent. That was always what it was about. Commercial competition, the City of London, all of that. So for the first time, it may well be that we have a Prime Minister who's prepared to play the strong hand that she has. Maybe she won't. But that's what it's all about. We do have a strong hand, and we just have to play it.
We have a strong hand, it's just weaker than theirs.
Let's take a look, because obviously this comes out of the white paper today.
Yeah.
They're suggesting that Brexiteers may want faster curbs, that there may be some kind of tension within the Tory party as well as within the Labour Party over how this should be played.
I think there's some uncertainty. I was rather struck somewhere or other. I read some UKIP person saying of this possibility, well, this could be a complete disaster. On the other hand, it could be absolutely wonderful. Well, OK.
So how has the white paper gone down with the papers?
Well,
I know you've picked out the Express's coverage. We only actually get a little bit of the headline there. Actually, here's the other side of that headline. Finally, a blueprint to halt migrants. How has the white paper been covered in the paper?
If you look at that confusion, and actually I think that UKIP quote kind of sums it up, which is actually what she's actually uses very well that sense of purposeful uncertainty, so that people can read. And if you remember the first few months, everyone on every side of this debate thought that she was their friend and, she was going to deliver for them until the conference speech. Now you see the same sort of thing. It is so vague. The truth is, the next 2-year block is so vague that pretty much anyone can read into it what they like, as long as you know that we're not going to be a member of the single market. So the papers are pretty confused, it has to be said, and people aren't quite willing to take a punt on their view on it. It
was a thin document, wasn't it? 77 pages. Some people have drawn a comparison with the white paper that Scotland produced around the Scottish referendum. I think it was 670 pages. It's thin on detail. Some are arguing. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, there's some wag that I read who said this white paper's got a lot of white paper in it, a lot of white space. Is it a good thing? I personally do think it's a good thing. I mean, I actually think that if you want the British government, Mrs May's government, to negotiate the very best deal for this country and to negotiate with the strongest possible hand, it is absolutely not in this country's interests for her to be divulging anything. And this white paper was dragged out of her with pliers, and consequently, you can just imagine, the best brains of in Whitehall being set to write a white paper which basically says a great deal but uses a large number of words and says very little.
There is a timestamp on it, by the way. If you download the PDF, you can see when it was sort of put up, and it was put up at 4:47 this morning was when they actually got around. So it gives every indication of being an all-night, cramming it in sort of dissertation job.
OK, let's move on, shall we, to the front page of The Guardian. This is the next story that you've picked out, which is Michael Fallon, or Sir Michael Fallon as he is now, the Defence Secretary, talking about Russia and, as he describes it there, the weaponising of lies and his concern about that.
Yeah, so it's pretty good, actually, that we're actually getting some very high-level sort of interest in what's going on here. And this is, Russia's quite purposeful attempts to subvert the way that information is managed in the States. We're pretty clear that that was a major factor in the American elections. We're pretty clear that they are trying to do the same thing here and have been for some time. And part of the story is trying to tackle them in that way. I mean, how you tackle this stuff is up to, I mean, how you stop people from creating Twitter accounts to swarm people and form rebuttals or basically to troll is kind of an odd question. Do we set up our own, within British intelligence to do the same thing? That seems a completely bizarre thing to do. But if not, we leave the information wars just for Moscow.
Well, one of the most striking things is that certainly the last time I looked, MI5 had on the front page of its website the statement that, you know, subversion is all about, you know, destabilizing the country, and we don't think it's a threat anymore. So basically, several years ago, MI5 shut down its specialist department looking at subversion. And now we're being told, quite rightly, that there's a major problem of subversive activity by Russia. I mean, how you deal with it, I think one has to be quite smart about it, and I think you have to sort of play them at their own game. But what concerns me is that we've kind of shut down consideration of this as a strategic necessity, and consequently we presumably don't have the level of inherited expertise that we had when we collectively thought that under communism Russia was the threat.
And I quickly want to move on to another issue, because in the Guardian article there, they talk about it being the hardest hitting comments yet about Russia from Michael Fallon. Just to contrast it with the Times page 2, which you've also picked out, the suggestion that Donald Trump, as he talked through the campaign, there was a suggestion that he might want to get closer to Vladimir Putin. He says he's keeping an open mind, isn't he? But this article says that the US lifts sanctions on Russian agency accused of hacking, they say.
I mean, we shouldn't forget, of course, that Russia now has its own American president. So that's very, very useful to them as they seek to control
the
information.
Manchurian candidate, once again.
Now, it doesn't matter whether we think that was, as you know, has been documented by the former MI6 officer in terms of actual dirty ops, or if it's something broader, which is this.
This is fanciful conspiracy theory,
which is a broader thing, which is it about the love that the hard right has in Britain and in France and in America for Putin? We don't know where that's come from. UKIP leader after UKIP leader, over and over expressing their admiration for this man. Trump is clearly in that category, at the very lowest level, you would say that. And we see the same with Le Pen in France.
A quick word on this, because we ought to get to a break, Melanie.
Well, I think there is a respect for somebody who stands up for his own nation's interests. Oh. That is what this is about. That's what the admiration is about, as far as Donald Trump is concerned, and as far as Nigel Farage is concerned. Pardon?
He invades and annexes other countries.
For sure, but nevertheless, it's. I think it's perfectly valid to look at Russia's motives, look at Putin's motives, and I'm not saying that I agree with him at all, but from his point of view, he is asserting Russian national identity, the old Russian empire as was. It's not that he wishes to take over the rest of the world other than that.
OK, we must leave it there. We must go to a break, but lots to talk about after that break, including, is Labour in a mess? The Times reveals members have resigned in their thousands after the Brexit vote. More on that in a moment. Welcome back to the press preview, where we're taking a look at the morning papers with the Times columnist Melanie Phillips and the editor of politics.co.uk Ian Dunt. And we're going to turn our attention to Labour now. This is the double-page spread you've picked out from the Times. Presumably this is off the back of the vote about triggering Article 50, is it, that you picked this out?
Well, I mean, if it wasn't this, I suppose they'd be falling apart over something else. But it does seem to be Europe for now. Amazingly, the Tories are now completely united on Europe, really. There was only one that, voted against, Ken Clarke, obviously, after a tremendously good speech. And now Labour are falling apart. There's mixed reports as to exactly how many members they've lost over the last week. Some people are saying up to sort of 7,000, some people just 1,500 or so. They've got a few they can afford to lose. I mean, they've got about 500,000 people in the party. They're the largest party by membership in Europe. But this stuff is really damaging it, and I suspect that there's something quite profound about the damage of the relationship between Corbyn and the members that have flown in. Members that have come in under him, mostly people with, quite liberal, left-wing politics that won't understand his policy on Brexit at all. And these are usually quite idealistic people who like him because he sticks to his convictions. This kind of messy situation he's found himself in, half-heartedly supporting Remain, then whipping his MPs into this vote, I think that'll go down very badly.
How much choice has he got, really, given the way that his parties, his MP seats are split so completely between Leave and Remain areas?
Well, it is a mess, but it reflects the fault line that's now in Labour between their old traditional heartlands of working class people, many of whom have gone over to UKIP because they actually want out of the EU, and the metropolitan liberal types who are Remainers to a man and woman. And it's that tendency which has taken over the Labour Party, and that's what's tearing them apart, because they no longer have a coherent demographic base. And it's not a question of how can they choose. They are kind of tossed between the two. They're stuck between these two different constituencies, and I suspect that's what's at the heart of it.
It would have been hard for any Labour leader, like even a really smart, nimble, agile, clever Labour leader, they would have still struggled. And Jeremy Corbyn is none of those things, and so he is struggling much worse than any other option possibly would have.
And do you think that as the Brexit issue continues, it's just going to get worse and worse?
This might be the worst of it in a way, and the rest of it is how do you control the process? How do you make sure you don't lose workers' rights? How you make sure, for the more radical sides, that you get some kind of other say on it. But I imagine they'll find other ways of tearing each other apart.
But if they don't sort it, they're going to lose. They're going to lose not just these voters that are leaving them over this vote, but they are going to. They're not going to be able to win an election if they don't manage to find a coherent constituency.
Yeah.
OK, let's move on to a story that I know has taken your interest. We didn't manage to squeeze it in the last hour, so we're definitely going to in this hour. I think it's on the front page of the Express as well, but there's the column on the front of the Times. Pilates, not painkillers,
yes.
The best cure for backache.
Terribly important, the most important story of the day, in my view. And I speak as somebody who has a back issue. I think Ian and I would agree, unusually, on this very important and really, for the nation, seminal issue. And I can testify from my own personal experience, you can stave off back surgery, certainly I did in my case, by having to undergo the torments of Pilates, which is really a no-brainer. It's all about strengthening the core muscles, take the strain off the spine, and it works.
I mean, I can't think of a less Pilates person in the world than Melanie Phillips, so I'm so utterly satisfied by this story that it just couldn't have got any better for me, really.
And I think they're suggesting it's not even just Pilates that can do the job. Stretching, they're saying.
Yes.
I think, in fact, that's they're talking about that on the front of the Express as well, and yoga as well. Any form of just keeping your spine mobile.
That's right. I think it's because we weren't really made to stand upright. And I think the strain of standing upright basically, causes some of us to basically crumble in the face of this terrible, onerous expectation. But certainly, the more you can stretch and the more you strengthen, the more that you can stave off the dreadful prospect of back surgery. I have to say, you think that I am not the sort of person you would think of doing Pilates. That is the understatement of the century. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. I'm amazed that there are people who actually pay to do it because they like it. It's my form of torture.
Only we had time to ask for a demonstration.
Obviously, I did something very bad in another life, possibly because I worked for The Guardian for 20 years, that I'm doomed to have Pilates forever.
Well, I would like to see some of your moves, but we're out of time. But thank you both very much indeed. Melanie and Ian, we appreciate it. Thank you.